Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to tackle the M8 Grizzly Walker from Konflikt 47. Now this is a Weird War II game, which basically takes most of the stuff that you'd be familiar with from the end of 1945 and starts adding stuff like werewolves and, well, giant stompy tanks like this. It's a really cool diesel punk looking setting. And it's available from Warlord Games, the same as all of the bolt action miniatures. And since I have a large American army, well, adding a single walker like this suddenly turns it into a Konflikt 47 force. Now this was a lot of fun to paint. I actually really enjoyed this. And the techniques I'm going to show you today are incredibly simple and easy to replicate. So whether you are painting a walker like this, or even an ordinary American tank, you'll find something here which I hope will be useful for you. So without any further mucking around, let's get started. Now very quickly, before we get started on the painting, I want to give you just a couple of tips when it comes to assembly. Reason being, if this is your first resin miniature that you're using, there's one or two things which are going to stand out as a little unusual compared to, well, some plastic kits. Now this big section across the top here, you'll see on mine is still probably a little bit crooked. If it's been sitting in a box for a little while, you're probably going to need to put this under some hot water just from the tap. Don't use boiling water from the kettle, you'll melt it and scald yourself, to straighten these out. As well, at the back here, this section where the top of that panel sort of fits into the engine bay at the back here, that's also probably going to need a little bit of bending with that warm water. So just something to bear in mind, because this is actually quite an easy kit to put together. It's fairly self-explanatory, but if you've never worked with resin, do bear that in mind. There's going to be a little bit of work, and I don't know what my camera is focusing on there, but keep your wits about you. As well, I have, let's just put that aside for a second, I have here the 50 cal that comes from the kit. I very carefully snipped the end off and drilled into the barrel there. And I've put a little bit of brass rod to replace that barrel because this bad boy sitting up on top of the, I keep wanting to call it a tank, but sitting up on top there, it's one of those things which is likely to get knocked around and probably just snapped entirely. So if you have got a little pin vise drill, make sure, take your time there, really go slow with it. And if you do muck it up, well, 50 cals, they're in most plastic kits. You've probably got a couple spare, or you could 3D print a replacement. But for now, that's all we need. Now, it's kind of hard not to notice that this bad boy is already green, and that's because I've primed him with a spray from Vallejo's US Olive Drab Primer. If you are going to paint more than sort of 3 or 4 American vehicles, which you probably are, it's a really good primer to have because, my goodness, the work it saves. If you don't have access to it though, you can use any sort of mid-tone grey primer and hit it with a couple of layers of brown violet. This is the old name on the bottle. It should now say US Olive Drab, but I will include 887 in the description so that you can find that one for what it is. But as long as you've got the primer, that's most of the early work really done. And we're going to move straight on to shading this bad boy with Agrax Earthshade. Now make sure that you're giving your acrylic washes a really good shake before you use them. Nice big brush, and then let's just start chucking this all over the whole miniature. At this stage, make sure that you are really working it into any recesses. So any gaps in detail, any little rivets and what have you, make sure that you aren't missing any gaps there. And because we're going to put quite a bit of this on, you're probably going to want to leave it for about 30 to 40 minutes to dry. Now it doesn't have to be Agrax Earthshade. If you have got, for example, Strong Tone or one of the Vallejo brown washes, it's really much of a much. All we're using is for this to really settle and give us that nice deep shading and accentuate some of the detail on the miniature. Now let's go around now, and this entire thing, here we go, with our brown wash. Now in my case, that took about 40 minutes to dry. It is quite a big miniature, so look forward to that. What I've got now is a little bit of brown violet. We're going to use the primer color again to sort of brighten this up. And what I have here is just a little bit of the packing foam that you get in metal blisters. I've also got a set of tweezers that they pinch when you aren't applying pressure, which makes them really useful for holding these sort of foam brushes that we're going to use. So I'm just going to dab a little bit onto the end of my knot brush here, dab some of it off, and then we're going to lightly just stipple across all the surfaces of this miniature again, just to brighten it up. Now what you'll see is that this tends not to dip into the recesses, so we don't lose any of our shading, and we'll end up with a neat sort of mottled surface, which looks really cool when it's done. So this will take a little bit of time because unfortunately you can't really rush this, but it will look cool as when it is finished. So take your time and just dab over the whole miniature. Now some areas, like certain parts of the arms or up under armor plates and what have you, you might struggle to reach. In those cases, you can either fix it with a brush or just ignore it. It's really up to you. Now that doesn't take terribly long to do, and when you're finished, you're going to have that neat, mottled, sort of careworn metallic appearance. I really think it looks great. It's so easy to do. You've left all of your shading intact, and now the last thing to do, really, to get that green looking right, is a dry brush. So we're going to mix up our color for this. Let's put this bad boy to the side for the moment. And we're going to mix up 2 parts of brown violet. So 1, 2, and you know what, I'm going to go 3, 4, because I want a fair bit of this. And then 1 part of dark sand. So because we used 4 parts, or 4 drops, let's go 1, 2 drops of dark sand. Now this isn't an exact science. You're going to mix it up differently sometimes, but don't worry too much. So let's mix that up together. Now if you're a little apprehensive about mixing your highlights like this, you could, for this particular color, you could actually use khaki. There are a few alternatives. You might look at some of the Citadel dry paints, although I can't tell you exactly which color is going to work for this. But this is perfect. Right. Now because we're dry brushing, I am going to scrub most of this off onto a bit of kitchen towel. And then starting across the top, I am going to drag my brush against any areas of hard detail. Now you'll notice on your first couple of passes, this doesn't show up immediately. But as you flick over it a couple of times, you're going to build up that color and get a nice subtle edge. So it's time to go around the whole model and have some fun with this. We're going to dry brush all of these edges of detail, paying particular attention to any rivets that are standing out. And yeah, go nuts. Here we go. Now all painting is a process, and this is one of those happy little accidents where I discovered because I was using such a soft brush, instead of getting a really sharp edge, I was actually ending up scrubbing the paint back a little from the edges. And I've got this neat modulated green effect quite by accident. I'm going to stick with it, but there are some areas that I do want to look a bit sharper. So I've got myself one of my other makeup brushes, which is a lot more stiff. The bristles aren't quite as soft here. And I am going to use that underhive ash here. So let's concentrate just on hard panels right at the edges. And there we go. That looks a little better. Okay, so I'm going to go around now and do what I originally intended to do over my accidentally nicely modulated. What is this? I keep forgetting the name of it. The Grizzly. Now that's looking much more like what I had in mind, and I really like that definition there. Now I did end up with one unhappy accident here. You'll see across the top panels, I had a wet finger, and I ended up hitting the dry brush with that, and then smearing some color where I didn't want it to go. But what we can do, I've got just a little bit of Agrax Earthshade again, a smaller brush, and we'll just paint this into the areas that I've really smudged that underhive ash. And we can tidy that up, no problem. It won't look perfect, but we are going to do some weathering later, which will make that blend in a lot more naturally. Now before we do any weathering, we're going to apply our decals. Reason being is once we're doing the weathering, we want our decals to look as chipped and worn as the rest of the material. So let's just get that bad boy on there. Now, which decals you want to use is up to you. Of course, whatever you think is going to look cool for your completely made up giant walking robot. Now, once the decals have had some time to settle, I'm quite liking the look of that. It's time to go ahead and we will do some of that weathering. So I've got one of my little bits of foam again. And I've got here, this is German Camo Black Brown. It's a super dark color. What I'm going to do is just dabbing up my little sponge brush like this. I'm going to use this to dab along the edges of the vehicle where I want a little bit of dings and sort of chipping to appear on the armor. So you don't want to go overboard with this, although you might do because in reality these American vehicles, I know what I'm saying about reality here concerning a giant walking robot, but American vehicles were often not in the field long enough to really develop a lot of chipping. They were quite well cared for, so you might not want to go as crazy with this as you first think, but it's up to you. It is a style choice. I like to concentrate on areas where the crew are likely to have walked a lot, so climbing up on the arms here, let's just dip, 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 dip towards the hatches. But yeah, up to you. You can now go as mad with this as you like. I'm going to go around the vehicle and just pick some areas I want to look a little chipped and worn. Now, I realized eventually the absurdity of what I was suggesting with going for realism, because I want a big dinged up stompy robot, so I put quite a bit of chipping on there. I've concentrated around the front of the hands where in the rulebook it says that these are used to clear terrain, so I figured those would be pretty dinged up. What I've got now, this is a little bit of gunmetal. This is one of the air colors, but it's going to work perfectly well. We're going to apply this in the same manner, but in this case, I am going to be a little more sparing with it. So just some of the extreme edges, like along armor plates and what have you. Let's add just a tiny wee bit of gunmetal. Now you'll barely see that show up on camera, so I do suggest be careful with it when you're applying it in reality. Yeah, now we're getting somewhere. Now I've got here a little bit of red leather that I've watered down, and you'll see this looks almost like a shade. What we're going to do is use this as our rust filter. So we're just going to get in here into a few areas where you'd want the rust to collect. Now this will look quite bright going on, but don't worry, as this dries, it's going to become much more subtle. So same as with the chipping, like really you don't have to go nuts with this. It is up to you how you want your fictional walking tank to look. I'm going to put quite a bit of it on because it looks cool. Now once that's dried, it looks way more subtle than it does when it first goes on. So you see in some areas I've gone over it just the once and it's fairly subtle. In some areas I've gone back and added a little bit more once the first layer has dried, and we've got this really cool battered, I love it. I think it looks really cool. Now we'll move on to now the gun mantlet, and I'm using, this is German Camo Medium Brown. Any mid-tone brown here will do the job, so US Field Drab or anything of the like. Let's just tip him onto his back because it'll be a little easier to reach the sort of circular thing going on here. And just one quick pass of this. Anywhere that it does still show through green afterwards, you can come back and give it a second coat. Now really at this point it's up to you if you do want to highlight this. It might look fine to you, if you've used a different color. I'm just going to German Camo Pale Brown, so the next step up from this. And I'm going to add just a little bit of highlighting to the mantlet here. Not much, but enough to make it pop a little from table distance. And then to blend that together just a little more smoothly, we'll add a little Agrex Earthshade. Now while that's drying, we can move on to the lamps on the front. Now I've got here off-white, but you can use any really bright color. Something like ivory will also work very well here. Now let's just paint this straight over the lamps. I'm not worried about whether or not I hit the cages on them. What you want to make sure is that you are getting all of the round part of the light needs to be white. Now once that's dried, that's gonna look terrible. But as ever, keep the faith. I've got here a contrast color. This is Ethermatic Blue from Citadel. And this one doesn't seem like it covers very well. but it works brilliantly for what I think it was really intended. This one, we're just going to apply straight over the white, and we get this cool, very quick sort of glowing blue effect. So a little bit of this in both lamps, and then we'll leave that to dry. Now that dries really quickly and gives us a very cool kind of blue glow effect, and I love how that turns out. Super simple to do. Now with a little bit of black, let's just paint over the, what do you call them, the bars on the lamps. Then with a little bit of glue, super glue specifically, I'm going to pop the 50 cal into the top there. And once this is in place, what I'm going to do is hit that with a little bit of oily steel. Then I'm going to go ahead, I will varnish the whole miniature and we'll do the base. And there we have it at last. Our M8 Grizzly Walker is complete. Now, you might be wondering where some of the metallic details are on this, but of course, if you go back and look at pictures and, recreations of armored vehicles of this period, well, everything was sprayed green. You didn't have exposed metal because that stuff, it was shiny. And you didn't want to be shiny in the field because that was a great way to get yourself spotted. Now, this kit was a lot of fun to assemble and even more fun to paint. Like, I'm really looking forward to putting this guy down on a table. I'm going to have to corrupt somebody over to the way of Konflikt 47 because this is too good to pass up. What a cool kit. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support is invaluable, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, and you will enjoy the rest of your day.